The granite of the Colorado Front Range does not forgive, and it certainly does not forget. It sits there like a row of broken teeth against the sky, waiting for something soft to wander into the gaps. I have spent 20 years looking at topographical maps and police reports, and the one thing that never changes is the indifference of the high country. People think of the wilderness as a sanctuary or a postcard, but to the earth it is just a digestive system made of pine needles and scree. We are talking about the Roosevelt National Forest in the autumn of 1999. Specifically the Big Thompson Canyon, where the air gets thin and the shadows have a way of stretching out long before the sun actually sets. This is a place where the history is written in disasters like the flood of 1976 that swept away houses and lives in a wall of brown water. There is a heavy feeling in the soil there. An ancestral weight that tells you that you are being watched by things that do not have eyes in the way we understand them. The victim in this file was Jaryd Atadero. He was 3 years old. A tiny scrap of a human being with a bowl cut and a smile that seemed to defy the grey gravity of the mountains. Jaryd was what the locals might call a vibrant soul. He was full of questions and short on fear, which is a lethal combination when you are standing at the edge of the Comanche Peak wilderness. On October 2nd, 1999, he was wearing a light blue pullover sweater and a pair of sturdy little sneakers. He was with a group of 11 adults from a Christian singles group, including his father, Jaryd Atadero. They were headed up the Big South Trail, a path that hugs the Cache La Poudre River, where the water churns over ancient boulders with a roar that can swallow a scream before it even leaves a throat. The group was large enough to feel safe. But safety in the woods is a statistical illusion that dissolves the moment you turn your back. October in the high country is a season of transition and decay. The aspen leaves turn into brittle gold coins that rattle in the wind like a warning. The temperature can drop 30 degrees in the span of an hour, and the scent of damp earth and rotting cedar hangs heavy in the nostrils. On this particular Saturday, the group was spread out along the trail in that loose, casual way hikers move when they think they are in control of their surroundings. Jaryd was at the front of the pack, running ahead of the adults as 3-year-olds often do, testing his legs against the incline. He was just a few dozen yards ahead of his father, moving through a corridor of lodgepole pines that stood like silent sentinels. There was no sign of struggle, no sound of a struggle, just the rhythmic crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant white noise of the river. The mountain air has a way of playing tricks on the ears. It carries some sounds for miles and kills others within inches. As the group moved upward, they encountered 2 fishermen coming down the trail from the opposite direction. These men saw Jaryd. They were the last ones to see him as a living, breathing boy. He stopped them and asked with the innocent curiosity of a child if there were any bears in the woods. They told him no. They told him he was safe. And then they watched him trot back toward the bend in the trail where his father should have been. Those fishermen walked another 50 yards and met Alan, the father, who asked if they had seen his son. They pointed back toward the bend and said he was right there. But when Alan looked, the trail was empty. The space where the boy had been standing was now just a vacuum filled with the smell of pine resin and the cold breath of the canyon. In the first 5 minutes, the panic is quiet. It is a localized confusion that makes you check behind the same tree 3 times because your brain refuses to accept the math of a sudden disappearance. Alan called out for Jaryd. The other 10 adults joined in, their voices bouncing off the canyon walls and shattering against the granite. Nothing came back except the echo of their own desperation. Within an hour, the quiet panic became a roar. The search that followed was one of the most intensive in Colorado history. Dozens of professional search and rescue teams, bloodhounds, infrared-equipped helicopters, and hundreds of volunteers crawling through the underbrush on their hands and knees. They looked into every crevice and under every fallen log. The dogs couldn't find a scent. The helicopters couldn't find a heat signature. It was as if Jaryd had been erased from the physical world by a giant thumb. The terrain where Jaryd vanished is a vertical nightmare of steep cliffs and thick vegetation. To a 3-year-old boy, the climb upward would have been physically impossible. The slope was at a 45-degree angle in some places, covered in loose shale and thorny bushes that would have shredded the skin of a toddler. Yet the searchers found no blood, no torn fabric. No shoe prints in the soft mud near the river. The bloodhounds were particularly baffled. They would catch a whiff of something and then suddenly lose it, as if the trail had simply ascended into the sky. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a search area when the professionals realize they are not looking for a lost person but are instead staring at a hole in reality. It is a cold, hollow feeling that settles in the marrow of your bones. We have to look at the anomalies here because the official theories fall apart under the slightest pressure. They talked about mountain lions, but a mountain lion is a messy eater. It leaves a drag trail and it leaves clothing behind. And it certainly doesn't pick up a child without leaving a single drop of blood on the trail. They talked about the river, but the river was searched for miles downstream with divers and poles. Nothing. Jaryd was gone. And for 4 long years the mountain held onto its secret with a clenched fist. It wasn't until 2 hikers wandered off the trail 4 years later, into an area that had been searched multiple times, that they found a single tooth and a scrap of blue nylon sitting on a high ledge, a ledge that a 3-year-old could never have reached on his own. It was as if the mountain had finally finished with him and decided to leave a receipt. The mystery of Jaryd Atadero is not just about a boy who went missing. It is about the impossibility of the evidence that remained. The clothing found years later was in remarkably good condition for having sat out in the Colorado winters, and the placement of the remains suggested something had carried him to a height that defied logic. We are left with the image of a child asking about bears one moment and vanishing into the ether the next. The woods do not speak. They only take. And when they give something back, it is usually just enough to ensure you never sleep soundly again. The case remains a jagged scar on the history of the Roosevelt National Forest. A reminder that we are only guests in a landscape that does not care for our company. This pattern of sudden silence and impossible displacement is not a solitary event in our national parks. Consider the case of Dennis Martin in the Great Smoky Mountains. A 6-year-old boy who vanished in the blink of an eye during a game of hide-and-seek and was never seen again, despite a massive federal search. Think of Bobby Bizup, another young boy who disappeared from a scout camp in Colorado and whose remains were found years later in a location that made no sense for a child of his age. These cases share a DNA of the inexplicable, a sense that the wilderness contains pockets of something ancient and hungry that operates outside the laws of physics. We walk the trails and we think we are safe because we have maps and groups and faith. But the mountains are patient, and they are always waiting for the next question about the bears. The search for Jaryd Atadero did not begin with a roar or a scream. It began with a hollow silence that seemed to swallow the very air of the Big Thompson Canyon. One moment, there was a group of 11 hikers and a 3-year-old boy asking if there were bears in the brush. And the next there was only the sound of the wind moving through the ponderosa pines. Within hours, the Roosevelt National Forest was crawling with over 50 search and rescue personnel. Bloodhounds with noses trained to find a single molecule of human skin, and helicopters that beat the air into a frenzy with their blades. They looked for a boy in a blue fleece jacket, but the mountain offered nothing but granite and shadows. The initial days of a search are always fueled by a frantic, desperate energy, but as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks and the temperature plummeted below freezing, that energy turned into a cold, leaden weight in the stomach of every volunteer. They moved in grid patterns, shoulders touching, eyes scanning the needle-covered floor for a scuff mark or a broken twig. But the forest floor was clean, unnaturally clean. It was as if the ground itself had reset after Jaryd took those last few steps away from the group. The dogs, high-priced animals with thousands of hours of training, would pick up a scent for 10 feet and then simply stop. They would sit down and look at their handlers with a confusion that bordered on terror, whining at the empty air. The authorities wanted to talk about mountain lions. They always want to talk about the predators we can understand. A mountain lion is a creature of meat and instinct. It is a messy eater that leaves a signature of violence. If a cougar had taken Jaryd, there would have been a drag trail of flattened grass and snapped branches. There would have been a single shoe or a scrap of fabric caught on a thorn. And there would have been blood. Even a few drops would have told the story. But there was not a single speck of red on the trail. No struggle. No sound. Just a boy who walked into the static of the trees and was erased. Then they turned their eyes to the Pudra River, thinking perhaps the boy had slipped and been swept away by the churning, icy current. Divers went into those waters, feeling through the silt and the jagged rocks where a small body might be pinned. They used long poles to probe the deep pools and the undercut banks for miles downstream. But the river was as empty as the woods. If Jaryd had fallen into that water, his jacket would have acted like a buoy, or his body would have eventually snagged on the debris. He did not emerge from the water because he was never in the water. The search was called off after 6 days of grueling, a heart-breaking labor, and the canyon returned to its ancient, predatory stillness. 4 years passed, and for 48 months the mountain held onto its secret with a clenched and frozen fist. The seasons bled into one another, snow stacking up in the high country only to melt and feed the roots of the trees that watched the searchers leave. It was not until 2 hikers decided to scramble off the established trail, climbing toward a steep and treacherous ledge, that the mountain finally decided to leave a receipt for what it had taken. On that high ledge, an area that had been searched multiple times during those first frantic days, they found a single tooth and a scrap of blue nylon. Nestled in the dirt like a grim offering, the discovery raised more questions than it answered. And the answers it did suggest were the kind that keep men awake in the middle of the night. That ledge was at an elevation and a pitch that a 3-year-old child could never have reached on his own. Not in 1,000 years. He would have had to scale sheer rock faces and navigate through dense, thorny thickets that would have shredded his clothing and his skin. And yet, the clothing found on that ledge was in remarkably good condition. The blue fleece was not faded by the high-altitude sun. It was not torn to ribbons by the teeth of scavengers. And the shoes were sitting there as if they had been placed by a pair of invisible hands. When the investigators looked at the remains, what little was left of them, the horror became microscopic. The tooth was not weathered as it should have been after 4 years of Colorado winters. It was pristine. The clothing did not show the typical wear of a body decomposing inside of it. There was a sense of impossible displacement, as if Jaryd had been taken somewhere else, somewhere outside of our understanding of time and biology, and then dropped back onto that ledge long after the searchers had packed up their gear and gone home. It is the signature of an anomaly, a crack in the physical world where the rules of distance and effort no longer apply. We are left with the image of a child asking about bears one moment and vanishing into the ether the next. The woods do not speak in a language we can translate. They only take, and when they finally give something back, it is usually just enough to ensure you never sleep soundly again. We like to think of our national parks as playgrounds, as curated spaces where we can touch the wild without being touched by it. But the case of Jaryd Atadero is a jagged scar on the history of the Roosevelt National Forest. A reminder that we are only guests in a landscape that is older than our bones and entirely indifferent to our survival. This pattern of sudden silence and impossible displacement is not a solitary event in the dark corners of our maps. Consider the case of Dennis Martin in the Great Smoky Mountains, a 6-year-old boy who vanished in the blink of an eye during a game of hide-and-seek and was never seen again despite a massive federal search involving the Green Berets. Think of Bobby Bizup, another young boy who disappeared from a scout camp in the Colorado mountains and whose remains were found years later on a jagged ridge that made no sense for a child of his age to climb. These cases share a DNA of the inexplicable, a sense that the wilderness contains pockets of something ancient and hungry that operates outside the laws of physics. We walk the trails and we think we are safe because we have maps and groups and faith. But the mountains are patient, and they are always waiting for the next question about the bears.